y'all, happy Friday. It is time to talk about Heartbreaker, the new Sarah McLean novel. But mostly because a larger McLean universe a la Bridgerton doesn't exist yet, hopefully. So I can spend the next however many days editing a fan vid to How to Be a Heartbreaker by Marina and the Diamonds to this book. So instead, I'm going to have to do it the old school way, like I did with Outlander and Taylor Swift many moons ago, and just think about it in my head and create those pictures for myself, you know, like you do with the book when you're reading it, or some people do. That might be a conversation for another time, or one I will never have about what people see when they read. Tangent aside, and speaking of the McLean universe, if you are like me and have trouble sometimes remembering larger universes and ties together in between books and series or in between series, especially if you are reading them as they're released. In terms of Sarah McLean, there's a TikToker I found that is doing the Lord's work and has a basically murder wall set up and is drawing all of the connections between McLean's work, and it has been great. I haven't watched all of them yet, but I have been going through because my romance book club is reading the Rules of Scoundrels series right now, but this is the first time since Bridgerton that we're tackling an entire series, though we are taking breaks in between. So it has been nice, especially moving from Rules of Scoundrels to Heartbreaker. And for romance book club, we just read One Good Earl Deserves a Lover, and it was kind of interesting to contrast Pippa against Adelaide, especially because they both wear glasses. And speaking of connections or callbacks to other heroines, in terms of the cover, this very much gives me Daring and the Duke vibes because we've got a redheaded heroine in yellow, really making me question, can I pull off yellow? I know I've worn yellow in videos before. I'm not saying I've never worn yellow or don't wear yellow, but I've never considered it my color. That being said, as a redhead, especially growing up, you get a lot of comments like, I wish I had your hair color, but this is the red I always wanted. Is this important? Absolutely not. Speaking of things that aren't important, but before we jump into the real meat and potatoes of the thing, so the step back of sorts, this is obviously a mass market. If you remember from Bombshell, I had a physical copy as well that is currently with a friend, and that came in a Mass Max. I did miss the Mass Max. I spent a lot of time trying not to break the spine. Anyway, the step back is on the back now for some reason. I assume because they planned it for Mass Max and didn't have step backs for Mass Max. The point of this is this guy, presumably Claiborne, but not the Claiborne of my heart. He looks like the villain in A Knight's Tale, and does anyone else see that? Do we all see that, or is it just me? I don't know. I like having these pictures here because they set the mood. I know that there's some contention around these images always. I like them. That being said, they're usually not who I'm picturing in my head necessarily when reading the book. And also, I don't want to imply that the picture on the back is always a new thing, because I remember very vividly when I was in high school reading mass markets, I used to tape index cards over the back of them if I was going to be reading them at school. One time my math teacher asked me to take the index card off the back because he knew what was there and he was messing with me. And I said, nope, and I didn't, and that was the end of that. Anyway, let's jump into the book proper. I have listened briefly through the Fated Mates episode talking about this book. It definitely felt like a proper Sarah McLean romp, but I also picked up on the places where she talked about pushing herself in terms of her narratives and just kind of progressing and trying new things. And I would argue this one left me feeling a little bit more emotionally raw than some of her others. And this is a woman known for angst and pining and really dragging all of those emotions out of her characters and her readers. And I found that very interesting, and I will get into some of that and what I found utterly romantic about this book. And sure, it's a romance, so maybe that feels obvious, but this one just hit all of the right places for me. And I found it interesting because McLean talked about on the Fated Mates podcast being worried that this wouldn't be romantic enough because it has a little bit more propulsive plot and action than some of her other books do. This series is kind of set up to be that and do that. And that's how we're kind of progressing and challenging the form for her as an author, because she hasn't explored the action bits as heavily necessarily in her books. There's always action, obviously, but here she's attacking it a much different way. And we have a girl gang that's out getting vigilante justice. And here again, we have a prologue of sorts introducing us to the world with Adelaide very actively. And again, we are not necessarily getting her introduction or her romantic past with the hero, with Claiborne, but we are getting her introduction into the Bells and her first foray into that world and what brought her into this world. And here too is where I like visually where it's drawing parallels with Daring and the Duke, because we find out Adelaide is a princess of sorts of South Lambeth in that her father is the head of the Bully Boys, which we meet in book 1, and is the kind of main antagonist of book 1, or one of them. They are the kind of hired guns of sorts of the aristocracy that these women are going after. And so we start with what is supposed to be Adelaide's wedding that is going to kind of combine and consolidate power between two rival gangs, her father being one of them, that ends in a standoff fight scenario with her father consolidating power and Adelaide getting swooped away by Duchess into her new life. And so we meet her, obviously, in Bombshell. And this is very interesting because in the first book, in Bombshell, we had to do a lot of establishing. So we had met Adelaide before, and we've seen her through Cecily's eyes mostly, who is a woman who loves her and a valued friend. But even in that book, she was kind of described as mousy and unassuming in many ways. And at the same time, we always knew that that was kind of a tactic, right? That gets her access because she is a master thief. And we learn in this book that while she is kind of on the outskirts of sorts of society in Mayfair, and there are rumors about her, but she kind of lives on the edge of the ballroom. She is a wallflower of sorts, this unassuming miss. We find out that on the other side of the river, she is practically a legend. She is known as being her father's greatest cut purse, and little girls look up to her and are told about her before bedtime. She's this quintessential survivor, and so we get this sense of rumor about her on both sides of the river. And I really like how it establishes both sides of the river in this narrative. Now, keep in mind, I'm geographically challenged on the best of days in places I know. So I'm not going to speak on the geography of any of this, but I can speak on the symbolism of any of this. So we're introduced to Adelaide in book 1, obviously, and we're also introduced to Claiborne briefly. They have a brief kind of standoff of sorts in the house of the aristocrat that in book 1, the Bells are focused on bringing down. And Henry, Duke of Claiborne, this book's hero, sets Adelaide down pretty strongly in that book and really pisses her off. So we get this kind of standoff charge to that relationship. That definitely comes back, but not necessarily as large as I would assume it would be. And that's one thing I found interesting too in the Fated Mates discussion this week, this idea that once you have put two characters on the page together, your readers kind of know where that's going. They can kind of draw those lines, and oftentimes you're locking that couple in. And sure, there are always exceptions. Like look at the Wallflower series and how in Devil in Winter, Daisy looks to be set up with a much different person than she ends up with in Scandal in Spring. Granted, different authors, but we took the flavor of that dynamic set in book 1, the tinge of it, and had to kind of adapt it to book 2 and the longer narrative. So we're starting out with this in the background, but it doesn't necessarily have to drive everything if you didn't read Bombshell. Because again, this series is a lot more active, and we're starting out with book 2 with action again, beyond that opening bit. So when we catch up from the flashback of the prologue, we are set and Adelaide is on a mission to steal something from her father. And while she's on this mission, she runs into someone else in her father's headquarters of sorts that isn't supposed to be there. And like 3 guesses who it is. You're not going to need all 3. If you do, that's okay. It's been a long week. So she goes there to steal what she originally needed for her mission, but she also comes across this puzzle box, which is what Claiborne is there after. And so they have some verbal sparring. They kind of fight out of this situation once they're caught. There is chasing, there are kisses born of distraction, there's jumping onto an escape boat, you know, the whole shebang. And as someone who doesn't generally consider myself a fan of action necessarily, or I'm not necessarily drawn to action movies because oftentimes I get kind of bored during action sequences, I'm not gonna lie. This is the kind of action that works for me. This is like Buffy-esque action, where it all feels quippy and fast-paced and fun, and here there is a little bit of an element of verbal foreplay to it as well. So all of this action, especially at the outset, really sets the novel on a propulsive journey to begin with, and that keeps the steam in the thing later when we kind of zoom in on just Adelaide and Henry, and we kind of lose some of the chase, but also knowing that them giving up that chase of sorts what that means for their relationship based on the stakes that are on the table. Because here, Adelaide and Henry run into each other again almost immediately, because Henry is begrudgingly summoned to the home of the family his brother is hoping to marry into, and Adelaide just happens to be there in her role as the matchbreaker, which no one in society knows she is. But the Bells have a larger goal here in that Helene, the woman who Jack, Henry's brother, is hoping to marry and has at this point run away with without them knowing quite yet, she has witnessed a murder committed by her father. And her father is notorious for running workhouses filled with children. And so the Bells are interested not only in protecting Helene, but in taking down her father. Because they, as we've seen, are fighting to reshape society from the outside. And this is very interesting too, because we also establish that Henry is fighting from the inside. He does not get along with Helene's father either, because they're both lords, and Henry has been fighting very voraciously in the House of Lords against child labor and trying to kind of bring down this empire. So we have Adelaide fighting from the outside and Henry fighting from the inside. And this idea of the inside and the outside and these different worlds plays very significantly into everything, because it's one of the main kind of roadblocks for this romance. MacLean talks about society being kind of the standard antagonist in her novels, and even though we have a much more active villain here, it's a much more externally driven plot than some of her others, even as there's always a lush external environment and stakes and obstacles. But here we do have an actual villain, kind of Clapus level third act, which I do love. I love that outside antagonist, slightly ridiculous third act handled by a deft hand, because it can go off the rails very easily, but with a deft hand, someone that really knows what they're doing, it is so satisfying. So they go after this couple. Adelaide kind of insinuates that her goal is to break the match, but really her goal is to protect this woman and get revenge against the father. And Claiborne goes after her with the goal of protecting his brother and this match and the love match that he thinks that they've made, especially because in his mind, Jack is the one that's going to carry on the line. He doesn't foresee himself marrying, and so he's protecting his line in a way as well. And so they set off and they're kind of racing against each other, and we leave the city. So even though this is a Duke of a hero, we only really see that title in relation to how he's using it to better the world for others, and not to be too romantic about it in that vein. But then we see him chasing after and entering Adelaide's world, even as Adelaide views her world as the biggest obstacle against any potential happily ever after they have. But even when their goals feel at odds, especially kind of like racing to catch up with this couple, there is still a charge and a flirtation there, because Adelaide basically says, if you can catch me, and then he spends the time chasing after her to these inns, and we go from inn to inn. And you know, there's not always enough room at the end. But we have this heroine who views herself as a wallflower in many ways. She views herself as unnoticeable. There is this idea that she can get away with so much, that she's so good as a thief because she can kind of slip in between the cracks, because people don't notice her. And she prides herself on that, even as there is all of this mystery around her. But we also have a hero, because if there's one thing a MacLean hero is going to do, it's going to be Pine. And here, he's noticed her for years. And so again, it's that kind of meeting of the minds, and she pulls him into her world and is also able to kind of make him see things from a different perspective. There is a line that I'm sure will be quoted around this book pretty frequently that says, "I am a woman alive in the world, Your Grace. My existence is politics, whether I care for it to be or not. It is not the politics, but the politicians." And they're talking about this idea of how to change the world. And at a certain point, Henry indicates, okay, we'll play by your rules. He joins her and the Bells in their world instead of her joining him in his. And it's this a little bit of a reversal, in the same way that it's a little bit of a reversal that Adelaide is the one keeping him at arm's length a little bit. Again, to compare with One Good Earl Deserves a Lover, since it's the one I've most recently read, there we had a hero that was a little bit emotionally constipated, as, you know, romantic leads often are, and he was keeping Pippa at arm's length because he felt that that was what was best for her, that he was taking care of her in some way by doing that. And here, Adelaide is doing the same thing. We get her internal monologue of what she thinks it would mean for him and his career and what he's trying to do in the world to align himself with her, and how she views herself as a threat to that, and also how she is unwilling almost, in many ways, to name what she wants because she is afraid of not having it or the loss of it. And I think that is what hit me in one of my most emotionally raw places. If you have a paperback of this, I don't know if the ebooks are paginated the same, pages 254 to 255-ish, toward the end of chapter 16, just hit me. On the top of page 254, it says, "She placed her hands on top of his, where he held her tight. No one has ever... She searched for the words, wanted me, come for me, wooed me, won me. She couldn't say any of that, obviously. It would make her seem needing. She was needing. She needed him. She pushed the thoughts aside and finished the sentence, noticed me." And we get this sense, especially at this point in the novel, like I said, these are two characters that kind of exist on the outskirts of their worlds, and they see each other so distinctly. And here's the moment where Claiborne is basically like, I have always noticed you. But we're playing in that vulnerability, and the emotional vulnerability is a lot of the middle of the book. Once we get these characters removed from society, we've gotten through that kind of verbal sparring, we've established the sexual tension, and then we start playing in secrets and this idea of Henry's puzzle box and what this secret is. I guessed the secret, but I was afraid of speaking the secret out loud because I was afraid of being wrong. So you're just gonna have to trust me on that, and I can never prove that I was right about it. It doesn't matter. The secret in and of itself isn't super important. I think the way it was revealed was done really well, because I think anytime you're building up a secret or a reveal, it's easy to feel let down by that when there's so much weight put into it. And here the secret in and of itself wasn't revolutionary, but I think the way the secret was handled and what it meant for our characters, this idea that it wasn't so much about the secret as it was about the trust and care and intimacy of sharing that piece of yourself with someone. And it plays with that idea of letting someone in. This idea, again, to reiterate ad nauseum, that they see each other, but also when Adelaide is struggling to give up pieces of herself because she is afraid of being seen too clearly. She's afraid of the loss that she knows is coming because she knows what she is going to sacrifice to save the man she loves, even if she's not willing to articulate it in that way. And we see our little more quintessential McLean hero willing to kind of burn down the world to protect the one he loves. And so I think this worked so well because the balance of external and internal just hit right. It really complemented each other. I think it would have been easy to feel like we'd lost the plot a little bit once we stopped chasing Jack and Helene, but it didn't feel that way to me. Rather, I was caught up in that emotional intimacy and the verbal sparring and the way that these two characters were still kind of in this cat and mouse game, even at their most emotionally vulnerable, and not necessarily in a bad way, but that there was always this kind of shifting of power in their dynamic in a way that kept things fresh and interesting and kept everything moving, especially as, because we were removed from town, we were zoomed in on them a little closer. In the first book, we kind of had to establish the entire world of the Bells, so we got to see a lot more of the Bells. Here we had a little bit more of a foundation, so we could kind of play into what we knew of these characters already. And this book really is about the kind of meeting of the worlds and the melding of the worlds, because without any spoilers, Adelaide has to deal with her past to move into her future. And so we go back to the beginning of sorts in some really nice parallelism. And I think everything just kind of wraps in on itself really well. And in that kind of final standoff, we also see Claiborne being accepted into this world, or kind of stepping into Adelaide's world. He enmeshes himself with the Bells. We've got Imogen ready to blow some shit up, and blow some shit up she does. And Henry is a smart cookie. He catches on to that, figures out the code word, and uses it to allow Imogen to blow some shit up again. So he's in. Speaking of Imogen, Imogen and Tommy's book is next. That is known, well known. They get a whole chapter at the end of this book before the epilogue, just them. And that makes sense because we were out of town and away for so much of the book. We didn't really have a way to kind of tease them out and tease the next book. But I find it very interesting because there is a lot of anticipation and excitement for this book in a way that feels like a level of excitement and anticipation that is often there for a series finale, which is to say, one, I'm very excited for the next book, but two, I'm very, very intrigued into the reveal that we're going to get in book 4, like what Duchess's reveal is going to be. It feels like a Chase Rule of Scoundrels level reveal in some way, but I don't know how, because I was texting with my friend Kelsey, who is also a huge McLean fan and much better at remembering things than I am, and we were trying to figure out who the Duke could be, whether it's that we know the Duke or we know the Duchess in some way that we haven't been clued into yet, like other reveals that may have happened. I don't know. It feels like that's where that reveal is gonna live, but I'm not sure. But I'm enjoying the ride and momentum of this series overall as well, because as much as Tommy and Imogen were a fan favorite in book one, and it would be easy to kind of feel like this book was a placeholder. In some ways, that was one of its challenges, that Imogen and Tommy stood out so strongly in the first book. How do we make Adelaide and her Duke stand out and people fall in love with them? And I think it was achieved. I loved Adelaide as a character. I love that she kind of played into and against this wallflower trope that is admittedly one of my favorites. I loved that she was the one that was a little bit more emotionally guarded. And I think that the way that that was built out really hit home for me. This idea that she didn't want to name the want, because if she names the want, she's going to be disappointed. And on the other side of it, we have this Duke that's wanted nothing but her. And not to get into the POV discourse because we don't have time, but I think that that's one of the strengths of the dual POV romance, right? You get to see both sides. So I was afraid I wasn't going to be able to put into words what I was feeling about this. Instead, I fear I've talked too long, but at the end of the day, I loved this book. I loved Adelaide, our Princess of Thieves. I loved our devoted Duke, and I loved the world they imagined building together, both on a personal, internal level and on an external, larger scale. So I will be eager to see more from the Bells and how they continue to impact the McLean universe. If you read this, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Adelaide and Henry, but as usual, thanks for hanging out and hearing mine. Read something good, and yeah, bye.